Hi, welcome to this week's video. It's the third in our series on mission. The subject is blessing the enemy. And this is one I'm not actually preaching in any church this weekend because I have a baptism at one of my churches, and this isn't an appropriate one for that particular service. However, I wanted to keep the mission series going, and I'm going to read to you a famous Old Testament story in the second book of Kings, chapter 5. I think I'll just read the first 14 verses. Now, Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now, bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Make the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. A number of years ago, we realised that our modest family hatchback car wasn't going to be functional enough anymore for our growing family, not unless it turned into the TARDIS. And we reluctantly concluded that we needed to buy a people carrier. And we shortlisted 3. We looked at a Vauxhall Zafira, a Renault Scenic, and a Citroen Picasso. And the Zafira sounded great, but it didn't have the boot space we needed. And the Scenic and the Picasso were fairly similar. Long story short, we settled on a Citroen Picasso. Once we did and we bought it, we saw Citroen Picassos everywhere. We had never really taken much notice of them before. And that's what you do when you tune into something, isn't it? You might buy a red car and suddenly you see red cars everywhere. And once you notice the theme of mission in the Bible, you start to see it everywhere. And it's there in this story. And this is an important one. There's quite a bit in the Bible when you look about how you share in God's mission when your faith is a minority or it's under oppression. And that's the situation for Israel here after losing battles to the army from Aram. And if we look at three of the characters in this story, we're going to get some do's and don'ts of the way we share in God's mission when we're that minority. So we're going to think about the slave girl, we're going to think about the king of Israel, and we're going to think about Elisha, and each of them as they relate to Naaman. So, firstly, the slave girl. Isn't it horrendous to read that this child is kidnapped? Think of when Hamas went on their awful mission into Israel on October the 7th, and they took all those hostages, including children. Weren't we horrified? Now, sure, I don't think she is being threatened with death, but nevertheless, she is in a traumatic position. But despite that trauma and oppression, this young girl is a real star. In verse 3, she says to her mistress, "If only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." So here's this wounded, marginalized young person offering love. Here is one who is both child and female, has no status, yet she offers love and compassion, forgiving love and compassion for one who has done wrong to her family, to her religion, and to her nation. Talk about a little child shall lead them. And here she does it by blessing an enemy. And I wonder if that translates into our situation. Isn't one of the dangers of the church having become a minority that's been sidelined more and more, that sometimes we're just tempted to carp and snipe at the society that's done this to us? We criticize this, we declaim about that, and we lay into something else. If we're good, we pretend that, oh, we're just being prophetic to the world, but if only we were. More likely, we're just showing the chip on our shoulder. More likely, we're giving energy to the resentment we feel that we're no longer respected. But the example of the young slave girl says, "Bless those who have done this to you. Look for ways to love and serve them. Search out opportunities to tell them good news. Not that God can't wait to singe them in the fires of hell, but that he's crazy with love for them and passionate that they find him." Years ago, when I was a minister in Kent, there was a branch of Ottokar's bookshops in Chatham High Street. They regularly displayed and promoted occult books. Alongside the display, there was sometimes the opportunity to sign up for occult meetings. We talked about this in a prayer meeting, and the response was interesting. I thought that some of the Christians at that prayer meeting would be the kind who would want to instigate a prayer march against the shop, perhaps a letter writing campaign to the local press. But they didn't. You know what their immediate response was? It was to pray that God would bless the shop and its employees, because that would be a better way of making a gospel difference. They were following the teaching of a guy who I would differ with on some things, but who said a wonderful thing. He said that in the celestial game of poker, a hand of blessing always outranks a hand of curses. I don't know who your Naaman is. Maybe it's an unpleasant boss at work. What would happen if we showed Christian love and concern for that boss's needs and difficulties? Or maybe it's an unjust political group or a multinational corporation that we don't like. How might we bless them and show Christ's love to them? I'm not saying we should never criticize and never boycott, but we do have to be sure that our motive is God's love, not vindictiveness. And that slave girl reminds us to love and make a difference with our enemies. But then, secondly, the king of Israel. Now, Naaman goes to his king, who prepares a letter for his opposite number, the king of Israel. Now, leave aside for a moment the naivete that assumes that it's the Israelite king who can heal Naaman. We have to excuse that as just innocent ignorance. It's something Christians encounter often from people who make requests of them. I find all sorts of expectations from people about what a minister can do, especially how much money they think I might be able to access for them because of their difficulties, as if I'm the entire welfare state. There's no point in criticizing. We can't expect complete understanding of our ways. What's more disappointing is the king of Israel's response. He says, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he's trying to pick a quarrel with me." The king of Israel cannot see human need for what it is and respond appropriately. It's almost as if he knows the latest story of the Trojan horse and sees Naaman's illness as the way in which Israel will be further weakened. And is that so far from some of our responses as a Christian minority today? Some Christians, in their defense of the sanctity of marriage, end up being very cruel to gay people. But why should we? But even if we don't agree with some of today's sexual lifestyles, why should we not offer kindness? In a world packed with terrible needs, it would be spiritual suicide to follow the example of the King of Israel. It's no good us getting on our high horse about the things we believe to be moral evils in our society, but then doing nothing to heal the pain. What about people we know, some of our neighbours? We will know people whose lifestyles we deeply differ with, people who have made a mess of their lives. Perhaps it's their own fault, but then we've resisted the idea of helping them. Isn't it time now to realise what a mistake that is and to reach out with Christian compassion? At one stage, some years ago, my wife and I were making ourselves available to a couple of pregnant women we knew. One was living with a partner and already had one child by him. The other had a second child on her own without the ongoing involvement from the father of either child. And neither of those women lived lifestyles with which we agreed as Christians, but we didn't cast them off. Would it surprise you to know that one of those mothers asked us questions about baptism? See, don't be like the king of Israel. Don't be all defensive. Show that love instead. And then finally, Elisha. And you think the story is going to end up with Elisha performing an amazing miracle. The slave girl calls him the prophet who is in Samaria, who would cure Naaman of his leprosy. The writer of 2 Kings describes Elisha as the man of God. Elisha himself urges the king of Israel to send Naaman onto him that he may learn that there is a prophet in Israel. So you think Elisha's going to be the big star. And so it's quite a surprise, isn't it, that When Naaman arrives at Elisha's house and the great man doesn't come out to greet him but sends a messenger telling Naaman just to wash 7 times in the Jordan, you might think, what's going on? We're expecting this great spiritual showman, and he doesn't show up. Here's my theory. My guess is that Naaman has some kind of superstar complex, and he's miffed that the spiritual hero won't come out to him. He's insulted by the thought of washing in that feeble, insignificant river, the Jordan. He's got celebrity rivers back in Damascus. He's got the Abana and the Pharpar. So, not meeting Elisha and suffering the indignity of the River Jordan force Naaman away from this hero worship attitude. And isn't that just what we need today? We live in a culture that needs to be weaned off celebrity adulation. We live in a culture where not all those people who are famous for good reason. We've bred people who are famous for being famous. And yet, here's what we can do. We can be the opposite of that as the church by a conspiracy of insignificant, non celebrity Christians operating without spin doctors or street teams, armed only with the love of Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit. We may subvert a sick culture and bring healing in the name of Jesus. And therefore, we have to address the celebrity addiction that we find in the church. Sometimes we want the big names, whether it's someone high up in the church, archbishop or someone, or whether it's a famous entertainer who professes faith, or a politician who is a Christian or something like that. We have an unhealthy reliance upon famous Christians and Christian leaders. Yet, we believe in the priesthood of all believers. It's time to stop this dependency upon the celebrity Christians and realize that this call to show God's love in the power of the Spirit is a call to all Christians. Let me tell you one little story about that. It's a story that comes from a book called The Forgotten Ways that was written, I think, nearly 20 years ago now by a mission leader called Alan Hirsch. Alan Hirsch is originally South African. He then spent many years in Australia. And if I remember rightly, he's now in California. Well, Alan and his wife, Deb Hirsch, used to lead a church in Melbourne in Australia. But before they arrived as the leaders, here's how the church started. There was this guy called George the Greek. He was a drug dealer. And one time when he was convicted of his crimes, he chose to go to prison rather than pay a fine. While he was in prison, he read the Bible, and God met with him. Upon his release, George and his brother John set about sharing their faith. Within 6 months, 50 people had become disciples of Jesus. Among them were gay men, lesbians, goths, drug addicts, and prostitutes. No Christian celebrity or authority figure did this. Just George the Greek and his brother John loving people into the kingdom. I don't believe they've ever written a big selling book about it. Just ordinary Christians. And this takes us full circle back to the young slave girl who blessed her needy master, who was part of the oppressive people against hers. She, Elisha's messenger, and the River Jordan are the heroes of the story. Elisha knows well to get out of the way. rather than garner praise for himself. Sadly, the king of Israel sets no example at all. But as we get squeezed more to the margins as Christians in our society, the message of this story is clear. A generation of nobodies operating from the fringes of our culture is God's apostolic team for the salvation of the world and the healing of the nations. If you're a nobody Christian, enlist for that call. Okay, that's it for this week. Join me again next week for another in this series on mission. God bless you all. Bye-bye.